Buenos días a todos. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos en esta nueva eh, conferencia magistral que va a darnos la doctora Françoise Baylis de Dalhousie University de Canadá. Debido a ciertos problemas no vamos a poder contar con una traducción en vivo, por lo que vamos a tener subtítulos en la parte inferior del video en inglés. Cualquier duda o comentario lo pueden realizar en nuestro chat. Van a encontrar la liga de registro en la parte superior del chat y también en la descripción del video. Posteriormente vamos a hacer la traducción de los subtítulos al español para que pueda ser consultado este video. Y sin más voy a cambiar a el inglés para poder presentar a nuestra ponente del día de hoy, la doctora Françoise Baylis. Okay. She is a distinguished research professor emerita at Dalhousie University. She is a philosopher with an international reputation for her work in applied ethics and the intersection of theory and practice. Her work challenges us to think broadly and deeply about the direction of health, science, and biotechnology. It aims to move the limits of mainstream bioethics and develop more effective ways to understand and tackle public policy challenges. Baylis is the author of Altered Inheritance, CRISPR and the Ethics of Human Genome Editing. She is a member of the governing board of the International Science Council, ESC, and vice chair of the ISC Committee for Freedom and Responsibility in Science. She is president-elect of the Royal Society of Canada since 2024, and Baylis is also the recipient of numerous awards and accolades, including most recently the 2023 Canada Council for the Arts Molson Prize in Humanities and the 2022 Killam Prize in Humanities. She is a member of the Order of Canada and the Order of Nova Scotia, as well as a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and Foundational Fellow of the International Science Council. Professor Baylis, thank you very much for being here with us, and you can start whenever you want.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for joining us today, and I apologize, I don't speak Spanish. I am bilingual. I speak French and English, and so sometimes I can understand colleagues in Spanish, but definitely would not have the skills to offer this presentation in Spanish. I'll try to speak more slowly than I usually do so that people can follow along. What I'm going to try to do in the time that we have together is to give you what I would describe as a whirlwind tour of what has happened in the last 10 years as concerns the research and the policy work and the publicity and the ethics of human genome editing, and probably with a particular focus on heritable human genome editing, where we're looking to make changes to the next generation. One of the things that I think is really important to celebrate is that this really is the work of two women scientists who were awarded the Nobel Prize relatively recently for their work. And this starts with a publication in 2012 when they make it clear that we would have the ability to cut double-stranded DNA and make genetic changes to individual cells. So this is transformative work. And one of the things that's important to understand is that many people relatively early on understood the potential implications of this. And what you see here, and I don't expect you to be able to read it, though you might actually, just capture, if you will, the titles, is two articles, two commentaries, one published in Nature and the other published in Science. And the reason these are important is that they already show you the scientific community leaning or pulling, if you will, in different directions. So in one case, you have caution, we really shouldn't be doing this. In the other case, you're sort of saying, well, we need a prudential pathway forward. And so early on, you get this sort of tension between different ways of understanding what the technology might make possible. These two commentaries are published, as I said, in Nature and Science in 2015, and that's just in advance, a few weeks before the science paper that undergirds these commentaries gets published in Protein and Cell. This is work that is done in China. with what are called non-viable human embryos. And this work is work that's done in the lab. There's no intention to transfer these genetically modified embryos into a woman for reproductive purposes. It's just work to understand what does or doesn't happen in terms of the early development of the human embryo and whether or not these kinds of changes can be made successfully at the genome. This research, these commentaries, if you will, spur the first International Summit on Human Genome Editing. This is held in Washington, D.C. in December of 2015, and I'm a member of the planning committee for this meeting. There's lots that happens during this 2.5 days, but what I want to share with you is an excerpt, if you will, of the final statement issued by the planning committee. And in the image there, you can see the planning committee. I'm in the middle there next to Jennifer Doudna. I didn't have white hair then. With respect specifically to heritable human genome editing, and that's when you're looking to make changes to the gametes or the early human embryo with a view to transferring these to a uterus in the hope of having a reproductive success, the birth of a child that's got a genetically modified genome, the committee says in no uncertain terms it would be irresponsible to do so. And it offers up two conditions: safety and efficacy and broad societal consensus. So that's 2015. Many people interpreted this as a moratorium, and you can see that very clearly in the news coverage that follows immediately after this meeting. The person you're seeing there is David Baltimore, a Nobel laureate, and he was the person who chaired the committee. And one of the things that he said repeatedly is we did not use the word moratorium. That's absolutely true. The committee did not use the word moratorium, but that's because the committee could not come to agreement on that. Some people thought we should use the word moratorium because it actually described what we were saying. We said it would be irresponsible to do this. Other people were not comfortable with that. But I think one of the things that's interesting is that that's exactly what the media could see, that this was really a call for a moratorium. It's a pause, it's a stop, don't do this. After 2015, and I'm just showing this as really a picture, a cartoon, I don't expect you to be able to read this, I actually do a lot of work on one part of that two-part ethics framework: safety and efficacy, broad societal consensus. Those are the standards. Irresponsible to proceed unless and until you've met these two standards. And I start working on, what does broad societal consensus mean? And I'll tell you, in my own work, I argue very clearly, this is not about unanimity. It's about unity. So it's very different conceptually in terms of what it's going to mean. I'm putting this up here to say that this is some of the work that I do around this concept of broad societal consensus. And I actually go back to work from the 1980s that was done around the Women's Encampment for Peace and Justice. And these were women who came together to object to the deployment of Pershing missiles. The women come together and they've got to be able to make pronouncements. And they're trying to figure out, how do we do that? And if you will, they set up these rules of engagement. And I use this as the starting point for me to figure out, what does it mean to move towards consensus building? I have a whole lecture I give on consensus building, so I'm not going to go off on that tangent right now, but I will emphasize the following. Part of why I think broad societal consensus is critically important is I think that what's at issue is so important that the questions and answers belong to all of us. In other words, this is not something to be decided by the scientific community alone in a laboratory. This is not something to be decided in the boardroom. And that could mean either, governments or private companies. That's not where this decision rests. It belongs to all of us. And so I say, imagine if we try to do that kind of consensus building in the kitchen, a place where all of us have to go, including the scientists in the lab, the politicians, the people working in manufacturing, working in universities, et cetera. We all have to eat. And that's a space where a certain kind of conversation can take place. And so I start playing with that space, and I start working with the metaphor of architecture. How do we design spaces in which all people get to participate in the conversation. So I'm now taking you from 2015 to 2018. What happens in 2018? There's a plan for the second International Conference on Human Genome Editing. This is to be held in China. It gets moved to Hong Kong. And in this case, it's in anticipation of this meeting that we learn about the fact that a different scientist in China has in fact taken that same science of heritable human genome editing, but taking it out of the lab into the clinic, and has impregnated women. 2 girls, twin girls, have been born with edited genomes. And that work was done, according to this scientist, to provide them with prevention to HIV. Now, what I want you to appreciate is that in the first case, in 2015, it's the science that issues a call, in effect, for the first international summit. In the second case, the summit's already taking place, and all of a sudden there's this disruptive science. Society responds in a very clear, loud, negative way to say that this is unacceptable. What's interesting, however, is that this is an excerpt from the statement issued by the Planning Committee of the Second International Conference on Human Genome Editing. And full disclosure, I am not a member of this particular planning committee. And what I find fascinating is that here what we say is germline genome editing could become acceptable in the future. And because it could become acceptable in the future, the claim here is that it's time now for us to develop a rigorous, responsible translational pathway forward towards such trials. Now, what I want you to appreciate is in 2015, the work's in a lab, and the planning committee says, irresponsible, should not be doing this. 2018, the research actually happens in a clinical setting, and we have the birth of children who are genome edited. And the planning committee does not reiterate the conclusion from the 2015 summit, but actually opens up a very much more permissive environment, if you will, with this kind of orientation saying it could become acceptable in the future, so let's set up some guidelines. What's interesting is that when they talk about this responsible pathway forward, these are the elements of that. And I think it's really important to see the shift that's happening. I'm not going to spend any time on any of these points, though I will allude to one of them later on. It's just to say that there's a different kind of orientation 3 years later. And I would say to you that I don't think science has evolved all that much, and certainly have not met any of the standards of safety and efficacy, and hardly started any discussions that would move us towards broad societal consensus. Okay, so this is step 2. We've moved from do we have a moratorium in 2015 to a claim that we need a rigorous, responsible pathway forward. Now, this is in the fall, November, December of 2018. And what happens after that is in March of 2019, a paper is published in in Nature, calling very explicitly now for a moratorium. And one of the things that I think might be of interest to you, and you can look this up afterwards, is several of the authors of this paper, myself included, and as well the first author, Eric Lander, were among the members of the planning committee for 2015. So we're actually surprised at the response by the planning committee in 2018, and we come together and say, okay, we have a problem here, and maybe people didn't understand what we were saying in 2015, so we're going to say it loudly and clearly, and we are going to use the word of a moratorium. And so in 20, the text suggests maybe 5 years, and it's in a context where we're saying, if you actually really want to develop any kind of rigorous ethical thinking around this, any kind of appropriate governance framework, you need time. And you can't have babies that are being genome edited popping up in accordance with some translational pathway developed perhaps by some professional organization. So in 2019, we have a very clear, loud call, adopt a moratorium. Now, one of the things that's fascinating is here you have a group of people calling for a moratorium. And in December of that same year, the scientist Jean Curet is now convicted and sent to jail. And he actually serves his 3 years in jail. And he's in jail for basically having practiced medicine without a license. He's a scientist, not a clinician. And that's the context in which charges are brought forward, a finding is made, and he is in jail for 3 years. Later on, 2023, and what we've had in between is the pandemic, which delayed what was to be the last of the 3 summits, takes place in London, England. So the first one is in the United States, but it's co-sponsored by China and England. The second one is in China, co-sponsored by the US and England. And the last one is England, co-sponsored by the US and China. And one of the things that's interesting with this particular summit is some of the focus of the meeting actually shifts quite considerably to talk about somatic human genome editing. And the reason for this, for those of you who might not have been following it, is we actually have what appear to be successful trials for sickle cell disease. Patients who are enrolled in a clinical trial have received somatic cell genome editing and appear to be cured. So we're actually spending time now thinking about the ethics of that. But we haven't set aside what's happening in the context of heritable human genome editing. And what you see here is a little bit of a pullback, if you will, a return to some of the language from 2015. So this is 8 years later. But now we see we need evidence for safety and efficacy, the same kind of language. And we're saying those standards haven't been met. We have not established safety and efficacy. But you'll notice a difference in the wording here. So whereas 2015 talked about broad societal consensus, here the language is societal discussion. And the claim is that discussion has not yet been concluded. So there's a shift, but it's not actually a return, if you will, to 2015. So one of the things now is to say, okay, so what happens after this? Well, what's interesting is we have what I'm putting up in front of you, 2025. South Africa actually amended its research guidelines in 2024 in such a way that it was really acting upon this idea of moving towards a rigorous, responsible translational pathway forward. It actually had original guidelines with the steps that had to be taken, and those steps were very similar to the ones I showed you earlier. But what's happening and what's interesting is that in 2025, they change it. They change the guidelines within a year, and they are now making reference to the fact that we need to have broader engagement, that there's still ongoing disagreement. And so that's one of the things that's very interesting. 2013 is calling for engagement, societal discussion. 2024, you actually have changes made to the guidelines in South Africa that map more closely onto what happened in 2018. And yet in 2025, there's a reversal. And so one of the things that I think is important is that now we're having ongoing debates, we have a need for further engagement. Well, what happens next? This is this year, 2025, and now you have a more explicit call for an international moratorium, and now you have 10 years attached to it. And the thing that's interesting about this explicit call for a moratorium is that it's not by individual academics, be they scientists, ethicists, policymakers, social scientists. This call is coming from professional organizations, and you can see the list, which is what I've excerpted at the bottom. So this is 2025. So now we're at that 10-year mark. We've moved in March of 2015 from 2 articles, Nature and Science, pulling in different directions, the end of 2015 and the first international summit calling for what some people would describe as a moratorium, saying very clearly it would be irresponsible to go forward. And then we have back and forth and push and pull, both internationally, in academic settings, in professional organizations, in the level of guidelines for research at the national level. And 10 years later, we have a more explicit call for a moratorium with a 10-year span, which would make it that from 2015, you were actually calling for a 20-year moratorium. So now we're at this point, a call for a 10-year moratorium. And what I want to share with you is that after that 10-year call comes out, or around the same time, I should actually say, you have a fourth international summit. But it's not part of this original series, and it's spearheaded by a different group, the Global Observatory for Genome Editing. It's held in the United States, and it's somewhat different. Its format is different, the people who are participating is different, and what I should have said, for the third International Summit, I was a member of that planning committee, and for the fourth International Summit, I was a member of this planning committee. And so what I'm trying to say here is that we have at least 4 summits. I was involved in the planning and the execution of 3 of those 4 summits. What's interesting here is it goes into a slightly different direction to say, look, we want to have ongoing conversation about what's important. We need to deliberate about our visions of the common good. And so the assumption here is we want to use science and technology to promote a better world, the common good. And basically, we're saying very clearly that therefore you need to have ongoing conversation, you need to have inclusive deliberation. And the interesting thing is that there's a shift a little bit here to say, don't focus so much on the consensus about what you think the end result might be specific to any one technology, but rather think about consensus around what are the right questions for us to ask and answer. And in that context, the Global Observatory makes a call for something different. Here, it's a call for a charter. And basically, it outlines, if you will, some values or some principles that ought to undergird whatever that looks like. But notice the first principle, begin with questions on human dignity and the common good. So let's have a conversation about what those concepts are meant to refer to. What is this we're trying to elucidate, if you will. And I'll just comment, I'll draw your attention to the fourth principle, reimagine the limits of research. And so one of the things that I think is really important here is, how do you think about research in this space? Is it anything and everything that somebody wants to do? Anything or everything that we could do? Anything and everything that we should do? How do we start thinking about that in a really broad way, but focused on respect for human dignity and pursuit of the common good? So at the end of the fourth summit, we have this call for a charter of emerging technologies. I'm just going to put up here for you very quickly so that you can see them side by side, the transition over 10 years. It would be irresponsible to proceed unless and until, and then you see a claim about safety and efficacy and broad societal consensus. In 2018, you get a call for a rigorous, responsible translational pathway forward. In 2023, you get a shift and you get a return to this language of safety and efficacy, but also this claim that we need to have ongoing societal discussion and policy debates, that these have not been concluded. And 2015, we need inclusive deliberation and maybe a focus on consensus about what questions have to be asked. So that's the trajectory, if you will, with the international summits. But I want to suggest that they are a reflection of where some of that discussion is happening in the background. So that's what's been happening for 10 years in terms of some policy internationally. And what I want to do with the second half of my presentation is ask and answer this thought-provoking question. Designer babies, do we want them? Is that the future? Is that what it means? And how does it overlap with such claims about human dignity or the common good? So I try to answer some of those questions in my book, Altered Inheritance. And the reason I've written this book is because the only reason we're having discussion, debate about this is because people can actually see some potential benefits to this technology. If you couldn't see any benefits, then we wouldn't be having any discussion about this. We would just discard the technology. but we imagine that this technology could bring some benefits. And so I want to make sure that we understand what those potential benefits are. And then I'm going to say, why is it that some people don't want to embrace these benefits? What is it that they're seeing differently, such that when they answer the question, do we want these designer babies? They don't answer it in the affirmative. They don't say yes. Okay, so what are the benefits of heritable human genome editing? The long and short of it really is that very first bullet. It would be the ability to have genetically healthy and genetically related children. So there are people in the world who cannot, without this technology, have children that would be genetically related to them and not have the genetic condition that they have. And these people are basically saying it would be really important for us to have this and not to have to be worrying about whether or not they're going to have the same genetic illness that the parent has. And some people, quite frankly, are very enthusiastic about taking this beyond a therapeutic intervention to thinking explicitly about enhancements, ways in which they could gift their children specific genetic traits that they think would be advantageous. So, if you will, that's really the argument in support of this technology. And the most important one, and the one that gets reiterated constantly, is this is the only technology that will allow some individuals who are afflicted with a particular genetic disease to have children that are both healthy and genetically related to them. These are two kinds of examples of couples in that situation. A couple where one person, in this case it's illustrated with the male partner, has Huntington's disease, and when that person reproduces, all of their children will have Huntington's disease. It's also the case for couples where both parties are homozygous for cystic fibrosis. All of their children will have cystic fibrosis. And so the idea here is that these are examples of couples that could be helped by this technology. I'm just going to expand very briefly with one slide on the example of cystic fibrosis because I want to put it in context for you. I think it's really clear if this is the benefit, we should talk about things like how many couples are we actually talking about? Who's actually going to get this benefit? Why? Because in the real world, we have to do some priority setting. In the real world, we actually have to think about where we spend our time, our talent, and our treasure. And if you take the case of cystic fibrosis, and I've used the data that was produced and published by an IVF clinic in the United States, and they're looking at their work empirically, and they're saying, if we look at this, we'd actually get to one case every 15 years. Is that really a goal worth pursuing? I'm going to be amongst those that call this goal into question. I'm amongst those who are going to say, I understand that there are people who could not have genetically related children that are healthy, but for this technology. And I'm going to say, yeah, I know they want that. And I'm also going to say, everybody doesn't get everything they want. And I'm going to say that this is not a need. And we need to think about where we put our time, talent, and treasure. And that's the argument that I develop in the book. Outside of academia, though, it's also important to appreciate that in the streets, civil society is objecting for a variety of reasons to this technology. And what I'm going to do now is very quickly, I admit, take you through those reasons, just so that you understand why there's an objection to this technology. Some people espouse one of these reasons, two of these reasons, all of these reasons. All I'm trying to do now is illustrate what is the weight on the other side of the claim that there's this great benefit and we should pursue this technology. What are some people saying that's not there? Well, harms to women is one of the very first things I encourage people to think about. And I developed this at great length in my book, talking about issues of consent, talking about the ways in which the women participants are in fact research participants, talking about the ways in which we need to think about the women who produce the genetic material that gets used in this research, but also the women who participate in this research by accepting the transfer of a genetically modified embryo. And I think it's really important then to think about all the harms, both physical and psychological, that go along with the overstimulation to get the eggs, but also to think about that not just in terms of egg retrieval, but in terms of a pregnancy. There are risks associated with that in this context. If things go wrong, there could also be questions around termination of pregnancy. And those questions could be very different depending on what jurisdiction you're in, but they might also overlap in very particular ways with the views and values and beliefs of the pregnant woman. I think we really need to think about the potential harms to women. And I would say to you, in my estimation, most of the literature here doesn't pay attention to the women. What they all do is they all focus on the potential harms to future children. But I think it's important to take a step back and remember that you are actually involving women as research subjects. The harms to the children are relatively straightforward, and that's to say, look, you imagine a couple with a genetic illness and you imagine that they're going to have a healthy child, but so many things could go wrong. And then what happens if that child is born and they actually are experiencing unintended, unwanted, harmful consequences? What do you do then? Other people imagine that, yes, maybe everything will work out just fine, but what if you're on that spectrum of human enhancement? And you have especially paid for some wonderful technology that you imagine is going to be something like increased height or hair color or eye color. And what are the ways in which that constrains the options or opportunities for the child who's born? Because they're now born with pretty heavy expectations. The other thing that's interesting about that is that they might start to see themselves as a product. What does it mean to have commodified the child, such that from the beginning you were picking the traits that you thought were valuable? And what happens if it all works, but those aren't actually the traits that are really useful right now? There's harm to future parents, and I think that those, in some cases, will overlap with the harms to children. But there's also ways in which we need to think about what kind of world are you creating? What kind of pressures now get applied to future parents in terms of the expectation that they should use technology in order to have children? And for those of you who are interested, I think this is very well presented in the film Gattaca. There's also harms to society. And here, many people are deeply worried about the techno-eugenic implications of this technology. And what I would encourage you to do is just very quickly look at those images. They're all cute little white babies. So what are the assumptions built into who will use this technology and for what purposes? And how might this entrench some of the problems we already have? Think about things like discrimination, marginalization, stigmatization. We need to actually imagine more fully what would be done with this technology. And I think these images show you what at least some people are thinking this technology would do. And then more broadly, there's harms to the gene pool when you actually start either increasing or decreasing the diversity of genes that are available for reproductive purposes. The opportunity costs, I've already alluded to that, but I want to emphasize it again. There's lots of money being invested in this. Is that the right thing to do? I just think we have to have a conversation about that. I'm not saying we don't invest it, but maybe if it's government dollars, tax dollars, maybe we have other things we should spend it on. In some countries, maybe we should be spending it on clean water. In some countries, maybe we should be spending it on vaccines. Maybe we should be addressing malnutrition. I think it's really important to appreciate priority setting. When I made that point about wants and needs, this is really what I was alluding to, the reification of the gene. What happens if we actually embrace what I think is a false belief that what matters in parenting is a genetic tie? I think that's wrong. I think what matters in parenting is caring for another person and shaping them into a member of society. And I think we will do ourselves great harm if we embrace this idea that what matters are genes, especially now when we have many other ways of making families, whether that's through adoption, through blended families. What are we saying to the parents of those children? That's not good enough. You don't have a genetic link to your child. I want us to think about that because it all comes down to the kind of world we're busy building. One of the things I'm sharing with you here is to say, I've talked a little bit about views held within the rarefied world of international discourse. If you think about the summit meetings and the issues that they get addressed and the conclusions that get drawn. I've shown you a little bit about what's happening in the streets, civil society. I've shown you some of what happens in academic debate and discussion with that summary of harms, etc. And what this does is actually show you what we know about policy around the world. And that's either in terms of guidelines, legislation, treaties, the Oviedo Convention. And what I want you to see is that there's no green here. And that means that at this point, there's no country that has explicitly permitted this kind of research. It doesn't mean that a country that's red now won't become green later, or a country that's gray now won't become green later. But what I want to do is draw your attention to the parts that are gray. And two things there. If it's a dark gray, it means we found documents, but they didn't actually say anything that was relevant to heritable human genome editing. And the light gray meant we couldn't find any documents, so we don't actually know. So they're strictly speaking not part of the survey. But what I want you to think about is the research equivalent of medical tourism. These are places where there may be no guidelines, no laws, no policies. And so what stops a scientist moving from one of the red countries to one of the gray countries? I think it's something worth thinking about in terms of how we imagine what's going on in a policy context. And I guess what I'm hoping, and I'm really drawing to a close here now, is what becomes important is to actually ask and answer this question. What constraints, if any, should we have on the ways in which we reproduce? Is this ultimately a personal decision? The state, governments should not pronounce on this. If a scientist wants to develop this, if a couple or an individual wants to buy this, who are we to say anything? Alternatively, people will have the view that, no, actually, these are not individual decisions because they're actually over time going to become cumulative decisions and they have implications for society. One of the things that I want to underline today is that this question, the question about whether or not there should be any constraints on human reproduction, matters not just for this technology, but for technology that is being developed now. And many of you may have heard or followed or read articles this year about progress in terms of developing synthetic embryos and specifically making embryos from, for example, skin cells, somatic cells. So not starting with egg and sperm and having conception, whether naturally or in a petri dish in a lab, but literally taking somatic cells, body cells, and turning them into gametes. These are imaginaries that are being thought about in terms of future design about how we might think about reproduction. And the examples here are meant to be provocative. The first example, the purple book and the page inside, imagines a world in which somebody, for example, who is in the armed forces, dies abroad, their spouse wants to have their child, and we have had cases like this already, and they go to the courts and seek permission to extract the sperm in order that their partner can get pregnant and have a child. In this case, you wouldn't have to extract the sperm, you just need some body cells. And so there's an imagining here that you would actually ask somebody who's in the armed forces to consent to this in advance of going into a war situation. And the purple book, which is an imaginary, is actually quite interesting in terms of how it sees this unfolding. The second imaginary is recognizing that if we can make gametes, if we can make egg and sperm from skin cells, then you would be able to allow same-sex couples to have children. Some people think this is great and it's progress and it's important, and other people think this is problematic. The only point I'm trying to make with this slide is to say that question, what, if any constraints should there be on heritable human genome editing, applies to a whole host of other technologies. And so it's worthwhile having those conversations now. I want to end, in effect, with this question about what kind of world do we want to live in? What is that future looking like? And in part, that's a function of how you're going to answer the other question. Here, we have news from this week. This week, several companies have indicated that they are investing in research that will take them to offering heritable human genome editing as a therapeutic intervention. One of them is called Manhattan Genomics, and the other is called Preventive. And they're basically moving forward with capital funding for this. And in the top left-hand corner, you have something that I kind of alluded to when I showed you that map. And I said, there's lots of countries with red, but look at the countries that are gray. Well, what I didn't talk about is I didn't talk about international waters. And what you have here is a company called Helix, which is offering cruises where you could, in theory, have genome editing. Now, in preparation for this talk, I reached out to the company. I wrote them an email and I said, could you please tell me more about what you imagine doing on this luxury cruise ship in terms of offering genome editing? I didn't get a response from them, but they did change their website. So if you were to go to Helix Cruises now, you'll find things about stem cells, about longevity, about all kinds of technologies. The genome editing page is missing. Luckily, I did a screen capture, and so I have it to show you that I'm not inventing this. So what I'm saying to you is that there's an important conversation that needs to be had. And if you look at that conversation, it matters because things are happening. And we're living in this weird space right now in terms of technology between the public and the private. Until recently, we've treated this as if it's a decision for countries to make. But what if countries set up rules and private companies do different things? We need to have conversations about whether you're going to privilege persons or profits. And I think that's critically important. And so let me end with this slide, which basically underlines the fact that my view is that human genome editing belongs to all of us. I'm using our genome as a metaphor and saying it's something that we have in common. And so we all have a right to have a say. And that's the view that I defend at length in my book, Altered Inheritance. Thank you very much for your patience. I realize I've spoken a long time, but I hope I've covered a good 10 years of what's been going on at several levels, from society right up to international conversations and governance. And I look forward to comments both from my interlocutor and the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Bailey. Um, Hold on a second. Okay. Thank you very much again. And if you're able to put your subtitles, please, your captions, because Marichu is going to do her commentary in Spanish. So if you're able to do that, please.
Can you tell me where I look for that? Sorry, under more maybe? Yes,
Yeah.
I see it there.
Thank you very much. So I'm gonna present Marichui. She holds a bachelor degree in law from Autonomous University of Nayarit, a master's degree in philosophy and pedagogy of law from the Graduate Division of Law Studies at UNAM, and a PhD in bioethics and medical jurisprudence from the University of Manchester in United Kingdom. On March 8, 2019, she received the Sor Juan Inés de la Cruz Award at UNAM. In November 2020, she was granted the National University Distinction for Young Female Scholars in the area of social sciences research by UNAM. She is currently a full-time tenure A-level researcher at the Institute for Legal Research at UNAM. Her research lines include bioethics, biolaw, stem cells, genetics and law, health law, and biotechnology regulation. Her main areas of interest are abortion, beginning and end of life, secularism, assisted human reproduction, medical tourism, and research ethics. Marichui, Thank you very much for being here. And if you want to start.
Thank you so much, Aida, for this warm welcoming and introduction. Thanks so much to Professor Françoise Baylis. All my respect and admiration, and I'm so sorry because I'm going to carry on my presentation and comments in Spanish. I'm going to do it as slow as you did because it was fabulous. So hopefully we are going to have a good translation by Zoom. Otherwise, let us know. Saludo con muchísimo gusto a pues, el presidente de la Comisión Nacional de Bioética, también el doctor Patricio Santillán Doherty, sobre todo a las queridas y queridos colegas brillantísimos de la Comisión Nacional de Bioética, que pues siempre nos traen a las mejores profesoras como conferencistas magistrales, y es el caso de la profesora Françoise Baylis, con quien tengo pues el gusto de compartir este espacio, pero de seguirla como admiradora de su trabajo y también como colega que fuimos en la Asociación Internacional de Bioética, en donde aprendí muchísimo de ella y sobre todo de perspectivas más críticas, porque a veces uno se entrena en visiones tan occidentalizadas que pensamos que todas las académicas tienen una posición occidentalizada, pero no, la doctora Baylis tiene una posición feminista y también que toma en consideración una crítica al status quo y sobre todo pues al mercado que siempre va a favorecerse de las fallas del Estado de esta visión crítica con perspectiva de género. Entonces para mí es un enorme honor y un gusto personal comentar un trabajo tan brillante y es muy provocador para muchas personas aún las posiciones de la doctora Françoise Baylis, pero pues por eso estamos aquí para este espacio crítico. Esta intervención la voy a organizar en 4 partes, sobre todo porque el tema lo exige. El tema lo exige desde una posición de América Latina. Ya viene respirando con dificultad en estos temas. Entonces, la profesora Baylis hace una manera y mirada excepcional de ver los problemas que se tienen con la edición genética y sobre todo hereditable, ¿no? Necesitamos leer esta propuesta desde la complejidad de las jurisdicciones en las que se llevan a cabo a veces este tipo de investigaciones sin ninguna regla específica, ¿no? Es decir, no podemos ver esto ni proponer situaciones ni principios desde un modelo único y universal. Los retos son específicos para cada región, entonces la de América Latina nos interesa mucho porque no solo son técnicos, son políticos y son sociales. Y entonces con esa mirada voy a hacer una invitación final para darle una advertencia cariñosa al mundo, ¿no? Lo primero que salta de la presentación de la doctora Baylis es que nos está precisamente, no podemos comprar una promesa tecnológica. Se defiende una responsabilidad política y moral. Desde 2015 hemos visto cómo el discurso internacional sobre la edición genética en la línea germinal humana ha cambiado de stop, detengámonos a vamos a pasar responsablemente paso a paso. Si algunos requisitos están cubiertos de manera estricta, bueno, vamos a ver una traducción clínica responsable. Y después, cuando tenemos investigaciones y médicos sin licencia llevando a cabo la aplicación clínica, decimos, esperen, necesitamos más evidencia cuando las cosas salen mal. Como decimos en México, pues muerto el niño, ¿verdad? Se tapa el pozo, pero no tiene que ser así. Debe de haber una exigencia de una deliberación inclusiva sobre el bien común que oriente las preguntas que necesitamos hacernos desde cada región del mundo. Este trayecto histórico que nos da la doctora Baylis nos muestra que no simplemente es un resumen de cumbres internacionales, sino que nos muestra una radiografía moral de la ciencia contemporánea. Mientras se tienen cumbres internacionales, la moralidad en la ciencia avanza distinto en cada región. La profesora Baylis nos recuerda algo que suele olvidarse cuando hablamos de CRISPR-Cas en embriones humanos y edición genética heredable, que cada vez que se levanta una mano en una conferencia y se dice, ¿estamos listos para ir a la clínica? No es una frase científica, es una frase comercial. Es una afirmación política con implicaciones intergeneracionales. La profesora Baylis pone el dedo en la llaga desde un punto de vista ético con mucha elegancia, pero también con mucha severidad. No basta con demostrar seguridad y eficacia en el laboratorio. Hace falta justificar la necesidad social, la necesidad médica y confirmar que no hay alternativas razonables para diseñar un plan de seguimiento a largo plazo, pero sobre todo considerar los efectos sociales de esta aplicación. Esto, que parecería ser una lista técnica, es en realidad una frontera que tiene que establecer la ética. Y si no se puede pasar esa frontera, no tiene legitimidad para nada tocar el genoma humano de forma heredable. Es punto. Y aquí quiero hacer un reconocimiento directo a la profesora Baylis, porque es de las pocas que insiste en esta parte. Insiste en que la gobernanza de la edición genómica no puede ser secuestrada por el entusiasmo científico, ¿sí? De unos cuantos, poquitos en el mundo. Y ella precisamente se detiene en una defensa profunda de la dignidad humana, especialmente de quienes han tenido voz en estas discusiones y sobre todo de quienes no han sido escuchados en estas discusiones. Y eso es pues para quienes estamos en América Latina y en otras partes del sur global. No es un detalle mínimo, es la diferencia entre ciencia con democracia y ciencia con colonialismo. La doctora Baylis nos habla de leer esto con esta complejidad y en el terreno jurídico tampoco es un lenguaje neutro ni de decoración, porque si algo también nos deja claro la profesora Baylis es que no existe ni debe existir un solo camino normativo impuesto de un país a otro, sino que debe de haber corresponsabilidad, cooperación, articulación informada, respeto a los conocimientos y saberes de todas las poblaciones. La profesora Baylis nos dice que la gobernanza de la edición genética es una construcción colectiva, no un permiso que se expide por un laboratorio o para un laboratorio con buena reputación. Y esto tiene repercusiones en justicia enormes, porque justo ella reconoce que los sistemas normativos no son homogéneos y esto no puede estar solamente en una legislación nacional formal, sino en otros regímenes de protección también de los derechos humanos que obliguen internacionalmente a los estados a tener la mejor práctica regulatoria. Entonces, es importante señalar qué nos importa para las generaciones futuras y en cada región y cuál es el riesgo aceptable para un bien común, si hay un bien común en estas técnicas. Cuando hablamos de edición genética heredable, el derecho no puede fingir que el único sujeto jurídico es el paciente al que se le va a hacer esa intervención. Estamos hablando también de hijas e hijos que aún no han nacido y así sucesivamente. Entonces no estamos legislando para alguien del presente, ni se está hablando alguien que no ha tenido una voz en la discusión. Y en esta cadena al menos se tensa entre lo médico, lo técnico, lo viable, el bien común. Estamos protegiendo a quienes podrían resultar dañados sin haber consentido. ¿A quién beneficia esto realmente? ¿A quién beneficia que esto se haga? Y si no lo beneficia, ¿quién pagará los costos? ¿No? Dijo la doctora Baylis, el doctor He Jiankui en China está pagando por una situación distinta a la que cometió. Es decir, está pagando una pena de prisión por no tener licencia médica, no por haber llevado a cabo una tecnología que tenía una moratoria y la cual no se tenía todavía luz verde en el mundo. Entonces, así pasará con todo lo que se siga llevando a cabo sin un debido semáforo bioético. Entonces, la profesora Baylis nos obliga a mirar a estos ejes en conjunto. No es cómodo, pero es honesto, ¿no? Nos advierte de que este lenguaje que nos venden de la esperanza terapéutica puede esconder un mercado con no las mejores intenciones. Entonces, esto permitirá a las parejas tener hijos genéticamente sanos. ¿Qué es sanos o propios? Lo que escuchamos en la superficie es empatía, pero se disfraza el biopoder sobre nuestros cuerpos, sobre los cuerpos de los demás y sobre la idea de las familias ideales, las mejores familias, las familias sanas, ¿no? Entonces, la doctora Baylis deja claro que lo que está por debajo es una promesa que dirige a un número de casos que son extremadamente pequeños, ¿sí? No son muchos y se cuentan, perdón, prácticamente en fracciones de caso por año. Entonces, esto no es un bien común generalizado ni generalizable. Hay que hacerse preguntas, entonces. Estamos queriendo diseñar un marco ético, bioético, jurídico global para solamente un grupo de personas, cuando ya existen otras alternativas reproductivas de menos riesgos, como la selección de embriones o la donación de gametos para evitar enfermedades genéticas. Esto nos lleva a pensar, si esto ya está disponible, ¿por qué no hacemos que sea accesible, asequible para todas las personas que lo necesiten? Estamos buscando o abriendo la puerta a otro tipo de demanda. No es la demanda que se necesita. La demanda de la mejora genética. ¿Y por qué? ¿Por salud o por ventajas competitivas? Por ventajas capacitistas. Y esta es una crítica desde la bioética feminista del capacitismo, ¿no? Aquí el derecho tiene la obligación de no ser ingenuo. Si normalizamos la lógica de tengo derecho a un hijo con tales características, es decir, sanos, entonces estamos convirtiendo las relaciones parentales en producciones de mercado personalizadas. Entonces la doctora Baylis alerta con mucha fuerza el riesgo de que los hijos comiencen a percibirse como productos fabricados, no como una biografía abierta. Permítanme decirlo como jurista latinoamericana que soy. Cuando los hijos parecen productos, históricamente las hijas parecen mercancía. Entonces hay que ver estas diferencias. Y los retos para nosotros incomodan, porque la advertencia es de que la desigualdad estructural con la que vivimos puede hacer que estas tecnologías estén disponibles para las poblaciones que son menos vulnerables. Entonces, no nos engañemos con que aquí hay un discurso de justicia sanitaria justa, futurista. No lo hay. Sabemos que, de ser el caso, van a estar disponibles para quienes puedan pagar, no para todas las personas. Entonces, la abogacía en estos temas es importante para señalar que no queremos crear un mercado de biotecnología para las élites, ni tampoco posibles seres humanos mejorados en términos de resistencia a ciertas enfermedades, que además nos lleve a generar más desventaja de la que tenemos, ahora desventajas genéticas por el eugenismo de mercado que esto puede llegar a suponer. Impuesto por intereses comerciales, desde arriba como siempre, financiado por todos los de abajo y accesible para quien puede pagar. Entonces, con razón, esto es un riesgo de abajo hacia arriba del eugenismo tecnológico. Para América Latina, esa frase no es ficción, es lunes, martes, miércoles y jueves, es toda la semana. La vulnerabilidad de las mujeres en nuestra región es evidencia, tenemos evidencia. Hay una explotación reproductiva, hay un turismo reproductivo, Hay extracción de óvulos bajo incentivos económicos agresivos. Hay presión emocional sobre mujeres jóvenes para donar material genético. La profesora Baylis nos recuerda que la edición genética hereditable implica más procedimientos invasivos para nosotras las mujeres. Esta hiperestimulación ovárica a la que estamos expuestas cada vez que se extraen los óvulos para ponernos en embarazos de alto riesgo, para seguirnos vendiendo como finalidad única de florecimiento el embarazo, la experiencia del embarazo, nuestros cuerpos a la merced del mercado. Y luego tener pues abortos selectivos que pueden también poner en peligro nuestra vida, para luego tener también partos complicados que también pueden terminar con nuestras vidas. Y aquí pues voy a ser muy directa. He estado en los foros donde ha estado la profesora Baylis y ella me ha hecho pues a mí la generosidad de invitarme como parte de estos foros, y hablar de la moratoria es necesario cuando la tecnología biomédica y los intereses comerciales nos han demostrado que no van a ser responsables, que los cuerpos femeninos jóvenes somos el insumo biológico y ese insumo se obtiene en contextos económicos precarios. Eso no se llama libertad científica, eso se sigue llamando explotación y asimetría de poder con género y con clase. La pluralidad nos importa, jurídica y moral. Entonces, en nuestros países hay marcos que protegen la salud pública como bien colectivo. Tradiciones bioéticas feministas colocan el cuidado y la no explotación en el centro, y también hacia las comunidades indígenas con concepciones no individualistas de la herencia genética, de la herencia biológica. Este posicionamiento y reflexión académica se lo debo a la doctora Baylis, porque justo estas interacciones que he tenido con ella y las lecturas a su trabajo nos da para tener ahora un seminario en la UNAM sobre estudios en bioética feminista, y nos falta traer el trabajo de la doctora Baylis porque pareciera que estudiar la edición genética heredable es algo chic, es algo occidental, es algo es algo frontera y fresco, cuando la doctora Baylis a través de todo su trabajo nos ha enseñado que hay una crítica importante de género, ética y jurídica a estas tecnologías. La necesidad entonces de traer sus reflexiones a América Latina para seguir apostando por una moratoria que nos lleve a una posición política correcta. El consenso internacional no se puede construir en inglés, en una sala en el norte global, con traducción simultánea opcional para el resto del planeta, y luego se imponga un estándar ético universal. Esa práctica, como lo vemos en la biomedicina, tiene un nombre y se llama colonialismo regulatorio. La doctora Baylis nos llama también a participar en cumbres internacionales, pero también nos puede invitar a que sean en nuestros idiomas, con nuestros conocimientos, con nuestros saberes de comunidades y pueblos originarios en el Global Sur. Nuestra región o las regiones no pueden participar como casos de estudio de lo malo que se hace, sino con una voz normativa. Y entonces aquí la doctora Baylis nos da una base ética para exigirlo. Porque si aceptamos que una vía translacional responsable hacia estas tecnologías requiere un consenso social amplio, entonces tenemos derecho, y yo diría la obligación de preguntar, ¿consenso de quiénes? ¿Debemos estar incluidas todos y todas? Sí. Y esto ha sido un ejemplo de las cumbres que hemos tenido, pero también debemos de poner en contexto las realidades situadas que vivimos las mujeres en cada región del mundo, bajo qué concepciones de dignidad estamos argumentando y qué mecanismos de reparación podemos tener para cada saber epistémico si las cosas salen mal. Y necesitamos decirlo, ¿no? Aquí no hay manera de devolver el producto. No hay marcha atrás. Entonces, para cerrar esta poderosa ponencia de la doctora Baylis, puedo decirles que nos salva de la falsa dicotomía que se repite en estos debates, de que hay solo dos posturas O permitimos todo o prohibimos todo por el miedo. La profesora Baylis nos propone hoy otra cosa más adulta. No hay aplauso incondicional a la biotecnología. El pánico moral también es paralizante. Es visión de futuro y de presente desde las realidades de desigualdades estructurales. Esta moratoria nos lleva, o esta invitación a parar, a precaución, a ver mejor, es una pausa de ética deliberativa para asegurar que cualquier transición a lo clínico, si llegara a ocurrir, no sacrifique nuestros cuerpos, no sacrifique el cuerpo de las mujeres, ni convierta a las niñas y niños en prototipos, ni profundice las desigualdades sociales, que tampoco nos empujen a un modelo de humanidad donde el valor personal se mide por compatibilidad o competencias genéticas de acuerdo a los deseos parentales del momento. Es así como es extraordinariamente importante hoy para América Latina llegar con justicia, no llegar por la puerta más débil. Y por eso se dice que no podemos dejar que en América Latina se sigan llevando ensayos clínicos disfrazados de ciencia, disfrazados por un viaje biomédico, con poblaciones económicamente vulnerables como material experimental y con promesas de acceso a futuros tratamientos que jamás serán universales. No nos engañemos. Son muy caros, son muy costosos y no todas las personas podrían acceder a ellos. Eso no es ciencia responsable, eso es extravismo biomédico. La profesora Baylis, con su llamado a una deliberación inclusiva, nos da argumentos para no aceptar ese destino, para aceptar ese destino como evitable. Cuando la profesora nos pregunta qué tipo de mundo queremos vivir y qué límites, si es que podemos tener alguno, pondremos a la forma en que nos reproducimos, no nos está haciendo preguntas retóricas, son las preguntas que necesitamos pensar y contestar. Nos está entregando una tarea difícil, una tarea ética de altísimo nivel, definir colectivamente los contornos morales de lo que significa la reproducción en la era genómica. Esta tarea no puede dejarse solamente en manos de las potencias tecnocientíficas, pero tampoco puede resolverse con un simple checklist de seguridad conforme a las regiones. No sé cómo lo vamos a responder, pero seguro que seguiremos cuestionándonos. Nuestra región, estoy segura también que no puede ser espectadora. Tenemos que reclamar ese derecho a estar y a decidir bajo condiciones de justicia, equidad y no explotación. Y esto pues nos lleva a resistir desde nuestros cuerpos y decir que no están disponibles para la experimentación. Y con esto cierro, ¿no? Una ciencia que avance, sí, pero que avance con humanidad, con lo mejor de la humanidad, porque a veces la humanidad no nos presenta lo mejor, con responsabilidad, pero sobre todo con una pluralidad ética desde todos los puntos del continente. Muchas gracias, profesora Baylis.
Muchas gracias, Marichuy. La verdad es que hay como otra perspectiva siempre, ¿no? Voy a hablar en inglés, si no te molesta. Yeah, I remember when CRISPR came out, the excitement of all scientists and in general of the population about changing some diseases, genetic diseases that are really terrible, actually. But right now, well, at that moment, the problem or the main issue was, what about the germline? What about the kids? What about everything? But with further studies and further ideas, these topics of exploitation, eugenetics, and design babies. I mean, this thing that was like a dream when Gattaca came out, now is like we have it. We might have it. So it's a little bit difficult to to understand what CRISPR and genome editing could bring to us, because it's very, very enormous. All the possibilities to change. When you change a genome, is not just us, but also what about plants? What about animals? What about all these things in nature that have found an equilibrium? But what if we change it a little bit? What if? So this precaution, it's important because we can change everything with just one mutation. And we have seen it with all the viruses, with all the antibiotics resistance. One mutation and all is might be done. So I don't know if Professor Bailey wants to say something about the commentary of Marichui.
Well, there's lots of things I could say. I mean, I think one of the things that's very important is this notion of regulatory colonialism. And I think that's not the language I use, but I think it's actually really important to be able to frame it that way, because in part that's what I'm advocating for, not ending up there. I'm saying this is not a decision that belongs to any subset. Whether you design that in terms of professional expertise or the global north-south divide or what have you, the rich, the poor, there's lots of ways in which we can come up with dichotomies. I'm not so interested in perpetuating that way of even thinking about the world, and I'm wanting to say for us all. That's the language that I use. It's all of us. And in my book, I actually did research around the concept of solidarity. And I have to say, I was very surprised to see that a lot of that work still relies on the binary of us and them. And so when you talk about solidarity, it's to be solidaire with your own. And that's not what I'm arguing for, unless we can understand that with your own is all of us, right? And so I think that that's really important. I'm looking for very rich conversation that values diversity, that values different worldviews. And many people think that I'm naive or Pollyannish because, I say these things. And in response, I'm prepared to say, maybe I'm wrong. And maybe we will not reach anything that looks like societal consensus. But I'm 100% sure that if we try, we will all be better off for having tried, because we'll have listened to each other. We'll have understood different ways of seeing the world, of valuing things. And so I think that that's particularly important. I think another comment that I really have the opportunity then to emphasize is that we really are looking at claims on the part of some about scientific freedom, as though that's obvious and there should be no constraints on science. And I'm saying we should have a conversation about that. And we should not only have a conversation about science in terms of constraints, but really science in terms of direction. What I'm trying to say is that as we make little decisions, we're actually taking little baby steps along a pathway. And I don't want us to wake up one day and say, how did we end up here? We risk ending up somewhere we didn't want to be if we don't have those conversations now. And the conversations we have to have, and I think that's my big question when I say, what kind of world do you want to live in? My work is ultimately about saying, that's the most important question. We have to answer that question before we get to the question, oh, should we do heritable human genome editing? We can't get to that question unless we know what kind of world we want to live in, because then we can say, okay, well, will that technology help us to build that world? Because I got a very clear idea about the kind of world I want to build. And I think if I can, the last comment I'll make, and it really goes back to your closing remarks. I think I didn't spend any time at the beginning of this talk on that distinction between somatic and genome editing of the germline. And I do want to come back to that because it allows me to make one very important and specific comment. You're absolutely right. There was a lot of enthusiasm for this technology, and I think there still is a lot of enthusiasm for this technology, and I think this technology can and will do great things. I think that what we need to understand is the difference between manipulating somatic cells and manipulating reproductive cells. Our somatic cells are all of our body cells except our reproductive cells. So our skin cells, our blood cells, our brain cells, our liver cells. And there are cases where we can actually identify right now single gene mutations, and we could try to make corrections. And we could help patients, we could help people who are suffering. And we see that already now with sickle cell disease. And there are still ethical challenges there because the cost of that therapeutic intervention is nearly $3 million. What? Is that a therapy? Do you really have a therapy if nobody can access it because it's ridiculously expensive? And that's just one facet of the problem. But we need to think about the ethics of access. My point is, there's a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of it is well-founded, and hopefully we're going to get better, and the range of conditions we'll be able to offer therapeutic interventions for will grow. But a big difference is if you make somatic changes to an individual, those changes die with that individual. They are not passed on to subsequent generations. So that's a very important distinction. And the other important distinction is with heritable human genome editing, I'm prepared to argue that you don't really have a patient. You have gametes, you have egg and sperm. You don't have somebody who's suffering in the world to whom we should respond. You're actually talking about creating de novo a person who may or may not have genetic challenges. And I'm just saying, you don't have obligations towards cells. You do have obligations towards patients. And that brings me back to those comments I tried to make, distinguishing between needs and wants. If you're hungry and you need food, I should respond to your need for food. If I offer you bread and you say back to me, well, I don't want bread, I want a croissant, I don't have an obligation to give you a croissant. I have an obligation to respond to your need for food. And there are different ways, I think, in which we can come up with some imagery to just say, our obligations are to us as a community, and that does mean that at times individuals will not get the things that they want. So I'm going to end it there and open it back up for questions and comments.
Thank you. We have a question from the public. Carlos Telles, he says, it is in our nature to evolve. Evolution leaves other species behind until they become extinct. So, does stopping genetic selection mean stopping evolution, our very nature?
So one of the things that I think is interesting is some people have argued that another reason to do this genetic manipulation is not to respond to this personal desire of couples to have children. It's really to overcome Darwin. It's really to say, we are at risk of going extinct. Oh my goodness. And so it's actually saying we don't want that to happen. And so we're going to actively genetically modify ourselves so that we can survive. And I actually do talk about this in my book. I say, okay, let's imagine that the reason people really want to develop this technology is because they understand that we will be extinct otherwise, and they want to save the human race. And so what they're saying is, we're not going to be able to survive on this planet Earth. Why? Because we're polluting our water, we're polluting our air, we're at risk of nuclear war. There's all kinds of things going wrong. So we should genetically modify ourselves. And some people think that means, well, we should genetically modify ourselves so that we can breathe polluted air, we can drink polluted water, we can do whatever. Other people think, no, that's a crazy idea. This Earth is just not going to be habitable. We should go off into outer space and we should modify ourselves to live in outer space. I think these ideas are crazy. I really do. I'm not persuaded that that's a good reason to pursue this technology. And in some respects, I kind of draw an analogy between this and a lot of the interest in longevity research. and immortality. And I actually think the pursuit of immortality is also a very bad idea. And you may not share my views, but I'm just saying there is something to be said about what gives life meaning. And one of the things that gives life meaning is the fact that it's finite. And so you only have a certain amount of time in which to try to accomplish something. And it might motivate you to move. Whereas if you're going to live forever, like, why get out of bed today? If you're going to live forever, like, how many times are you going to get married? Like, how many times should you have children? Like, what does it mean to retire? Like, I mean, you're calling into question a whole way of understanding our place in the world. And if I can, I want to make one more comment, which actually goes back to an earlier comment about our ability to not only genetically modify ourselves, but to genetically modify other things, whether it's animals or plants, etc. And I want to say to you, the thing I worry about the most there, which is why I think my answer to that question overlaps with this most recent question, is we only have a blinkered view of the world where we only pay attention to the human. When we modify plants, it's for the benefit of humans. When we modify animals, it's for the benefit of humans. I mean, think about the project. Oh, well, we're going to genetically modify cats because I have an allergy to cats, but I want to have this cat, but I'm going to genetically modify it. Or, I have cattle, but these horns bother me and they're at risk for me, the humans. So I'm going to modify the cattle so it doesn't have horns. There are these mosquitoes and they might transmit disease to me, so I'm going to genetically modify the mosquitoes. And I say, you got to stop and think, like, do we really, really, really want to live in a place that understands that everything is just for us and we just exploit everything? That's a worldview that I think is flawed. That's a place where if we actually have conversations with a range of people, we could get exposed to other worldviews where our role is to have responsibility for the planet and stewardship, not ownership and manipulation and a re-entrenchment of a certain kind of narrow understanding of the place of humans at the apex of everything. And I think that's a mistake.
Marichu, do you have a remark on this?
No. I'm in the same line as Professor Baylis, and I also agree, concur in everything. I'm sorry I lost my connection. That is why I need to leave. But I think that I have to correct myself because we are not talking about patients here. That's true. These are cells, gametes, or these are living. Living species like animals, plants, everything that we care for. So we need to have not similar, but we have to care in relation to these living species, right? And that is a concept that we talk now in feminist bioethics, relational autonomy, which is really important in this discussion as well.
I just want to mention that sometimes we forget that evolution is a concept that takes a lot of time. I mean, we want to see humans or a species to evolve really, really fast. Like, we want to see it, but evolution takes a lot of time. And we as humans, we have evolved, but like, we resist to more diseases than before. But I mean, we have seen the evolution when we modify a species, like Professor Bailey said, like with cattle, with dogs. Dogs are a great example of a kind of evolution because it's an artificial selection. But evolution is just took took its time. I mean, it's slow and it goes so a species can um, live where they live and the space they take. And we just have changed it so we are more comfortable. And I think that sometimes maybe that have stopped human evolution instead of helping it. Because now we don't have anything to adapt to. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I think you're raising a really important point, and it allows me to say two things. One of the things is that evolution happens in a direction to promote survival and reproducibility. And we're really in a space where people are talking about picking traits that may have nothing to do with either of those things, right? They might have to do with just a fad. This is what we think is nice or interesting or cool or advantageous. And I think that that's the first thing to think about, there are actually different kinds of orientations to the choosing that gets imposed when you have the human hand involved in making those changes, and the directionality could be very, very different. So I think that that's one thing to think about in terms of evolution. The other thing to think about is the hubris of thinking that we know which traits to pick and choose. And so if we take something really simple like height, humans are taller over time. Our species, Homo sapiens, has gotten taller over time. And some of that's genetics and some of that's environment. And so one of the other thing that happens in this context about evolution is we actually somehow say this having forgotten about the gene environment interaction. And, I admit, even in some of my talks, it may sound like I've embraced genetic determinism, but I really haven't. I understand that gene environment interaction, and that's also critical for survival, which is why I was saying we might not be able to survive on this planet. And it's not just about our genes, it's about the environment in which this gene bundle has to try to live. And I think that it's in that context that we should think about, again, what it means to have a good life. If we decide that height is the thing and it's not something that happens slowly over time, we're just going to think everybody should be 7 feet tall. Well, what does that do to all the buildings that people now have to crouch to get into the doorways? What does that do to the game of basketball if everybody's just tall and can sit above the basket and do this? I mean, where's the game? I mean, and I'm being somewhat facetious, but it's to say we're not thinking about what are the goals and objectives. And if you actually are trying to get some kind of a social advantage, if everybody gets it, then you've lost the social advantage. So if everybody's 7 feet tall, being 7 feet tall is not an advantage when you play basketball. So somebody's going to have to be 8 feet tall. I mean, it just seems to me a bit crazy making. So yes, I think really important to understand evolution, how it works, gene environment interaction, time, and an orientation for survival and reproducibility. And all of that's kind of going out the window with this attempt to control a particular set of genetic traits, if you will.
Okay, yes. Another question. What oversight and long-term monitoring are needed to make sure germline editing isn't used in humans before it's truly safe?
So one of the things that's challenging about this space is it will never be 100% safe, and it will never be 100% effective. So for me, one of the things that becomes critically important is we have to understand that that fact exposes the reality of how facts and values intersect. The fact that we will never be 100% safe and effective means that somebody, some group, some authority, some individual, something has to make a decision that says it's safe enough, it's effective enough. And that's the huge value component to what other people might think is just a hardcore science question. And the scientists will answer that for us. They'll tell us when it's safe and effective. And my answer is they might try to tell us what they think is safe enough and effective enough. But because it's a value decision, it belongs to all of us. And I think that's what I'm really trying to say. We all have a right to comment and to think about this question, to think about the world we're busy contributing to, creating. And I want to be really clear. I understand some people don't want to participate in that conversation, and that's great. I mean, if you're having trouble putting food on the table, whether that's because you're in the United States and you haven't got any supports, whether that's because you're in Africa and there's a famine, it doesn't matter what the reason is. If that's your priority, maybe you don't want to talk to me about human genome editing. You're going to say, sorry, just not an important topic for me. And I understand that. But for those who do want to have something to say about this, they shouldn't be locked out of that conversation. They shouldn't be told, you don't have an opinion that counts. Because we all have an opinion that counts when we're thinking about changing the human evolutionary story.
Marichuy, hello? Okay. So Another question is, what core features should a public policy research forum have to ensure that discussions of human germline genome editing are transparent, inclusive, evidence-driven, and accountable?
Well, I think, I'm going to be honest and say that's a tall order. That's hard. And if I go back to 2015 and that very first statement that gets issued by the Planning Committee for the first international summit, it said it was irresponsible unless and until you could show safety and efficacy and broad societal consensus. I have said repeatedly that that's probably one of the simplest ethics frameworks you will ever see. I can tell you, people that work in ethics, when they develop their ethics frameworks, they have lots of elements. There were two here. And I actually thought that that was beautiful because it's simple, right? There's two things you've got to do. And yet what I also thought was really wonderful is that nobody knew what either of those two things meant. I mean, isn't that wonderful? You've introduced an ethics framework and nobody really knows what it means. And I didn't think that was a problem. I thought that was actually great because I thought the standard was there and now we would spend time unpacking that. That would be the prompt for the discussions. We would have conversations about, well, what's safe enough? What's effective enough? What do we think we mean by those two things? And then with the notion of broad societal consensus, it was really the same thing. What do we think we mean by that? So it was meant to be an exploration of exactly how will we have those conversations. We have amazing technology in terms of IT that we've never had before. How can we use that to have conversations? How can we use translation services of a quality and kind we've never had before in ways that are cheap, if not cost effective? How can we use technology to pursue that goal of a global conversation? And I thought this was going to be a wonderful technology to showcase how we would think about it. And let me underline why I think this notion of broad societal consensus is so important. I think it's critically important because it's not limited to human genome editing. We actually have to learn how to have these conversations for all of the convergent technologies we have. You want to talk about artificial intelligence? We need to start having some global conversations. This isn't something that can be dealt with in one community, in one country. And it's also not something that can be done in such a way that leaves out the private sector. So we have to learn how to have conversations between the public and the private sector in ways that are going to be fruitful. You want to talk about exploring outer space? We need to talk about that. And I think I'm not able to give you a good answer to how we do it because I think that's where we need to do meaningful research because I think we are committed to all those things you said. We are intellectually committed to transparency. We're committed to accountability. We're committed to inclusiveness. I really believe most people are. If you ask them, they'll say, yeah, those are really good things. And we have to now learn how to operationalize those commitments. And I will tell you up front, I don't know how to do that. That doesn't mean it's not worth doing. It means we need to really harness the talent around the world to find ways of doing that.
May I say something about it? I completely agree with you, Professor Baylis. Now I was thinking about, yes, you are inclusive. You're really, when you are participating in these international summits and when you talk about having all of their voices and we are doing the right things because we need to have this consensus, at least trying to unpack all of the ethical standards and or all of the ethical principles we want to be in place. Transparency, access to the knowledge, it's very important. Access to the therapist, if any, the cost. But when I think about the cost and the economic interest of few, I don't know. This is more like a question for you because it's something that I cannot respond as well. Like sometimes few economic interests overlap or greater good faith, good reasons, and good practices in this area. So how can we navigate? How can we build bridges in order to attempt to bring them to the discussion and to comply with the ethical thinkings and reasons that we give for these technologies?
So I think we actually have a very real problem, which we haven't talked about thus far in a very explicit way, and that is contemporary capitalism and the growing, unacceptable divide between the haves and the have-nots. And we are seeing that, I think, in a way that I certainly haven't seen in my lifetime before, where the gap between the uber wealthy and the average has just gotten to be repulsive, I think would be the right word. I mean, I could say something like unethical, but I mean, it's beyond unethical. It's actually outrageous that we have allowed this to happen, and we appear to be actually allowing it to increase even further. And I would say to you that many of us know that this is a problem because you hear constantly references to France and the Revolution and Marie Antoinette and the total disregard between the classes, the very, very wealthy and the rest of us. And I think one of the things I worry about in this space is that, are we going to see a world in which the have and have-nots are no longer limited to our economic and our social status, but will in fact now be entrenched in our DNA? And so we're now going to have that discord become a biological one on top of a social and a financial and an economic and a political one. So I think we really are at risk of creating a dystopia. And I think that's why I want to not focus on all the ways in which we could go down a pathway that's problematic, but let's focus on what we agree on and then see, can we make progress? And I do still want to believe that the vast majority of us are committed to positive ethical values. And some of them are procedural, which the previous person referred to in terms of things like transparency, accountability, et cetera. But I think that we also have a lot of commonality around vaguer concepts like respect for persons, solidarity, social justice. I think what we want to do is find how can we anchor those positive beliefs and how can we embrace technology in pursuit of common goals. And what I worry about at the end of the day is we will, in fact, as I said, exacerbate the divide between the haves and the have-nots by moving it into our genes. And that's a problem.
Thank you very much. Well, we only have 10 minutes and we don't have further questions. So there's a commentary about from Claudia Macias. She says, certainly, certainly the commercialization of women's bodies for the purpose of advancing research has not been sufficiently regulated. Greetings. So, yeah, there's a lot of perspectives and a lot of ramifications from just one technology. In this case, CRISPR. But
yes. But I think if I can, I'd like to just take a few minutes since we have them to just expand on that point, because I understand that when I gave you those individual slides about the various harms, I kind of raced through them because there's a lot to unpack and time was limited. But let me just unpack the one about the harms to women. I'm very frustrated by the fact that a lot of work that has happened in the space of reproduction is happening on women's bodies without adequate attention to their interests. And sometimes it's important to appreciate that their interests are information. I want accurate disclosure of information so that I can make good choices. So they're not saying I'm for or against this technology. They're saying, if I'm going to participate, I just want to have good knowledge. And they're saying, I'm a competent person. I can choose for myself, but it's unfair to ask me to make choices when I don't get information. And that, for example, loud and clear from a number of women who are in fact egg donors or egg sellers. So they participate willingly, and they're not saying that they've been exploited, but they're saying they're not really giving an informed consent. And so we should listen to that voice. I think another voice that becomes really important in this space is to understand it's not so difficult to get sperm from men. It's actually very difficult to get eggs from women. And in this space, the conversations about human genome editing often happen as if you just go into your lab and you pick up a couple of jars and they have all the genetic material that you need. And we don't pay attention to what it is you ask of women to do as a research participant. And I think you have to name them. They are research participants. And then you have to think about all of the things that go with research ethics in terms of how you engage with the women. And let me give you just one very specific example, the issue of payment. In this space, in the context of reproduction, women who are egg providers have the option in some countries legitimately of getting financial remuneration for their eggs. One of the things that's interesting is that in the research space, researchers have argued, no, we shouldn't have to pay for those eggs. Well, why not? Well, the answer is, well, then we wouldn't be able to do the research. The research would just be so expensive if on top of everything else, we had to pay $5,000 for some eggs. Well, I'm not saying we should or shouldn't pay them. I actually have, very complicated views around the issue of payment, but I'm saying, why should the use of the egg, whether it's for reproduction or for research, be the deciding factor? Those women are going to undergo exactly the same kinds of potential harms and risks. So if you think they should be paid in either direction. If you think they shouldn't be paid in either direction. But we don't have those conversations, right? And think about how complicated that is. That's not just a discussion about whether or not women are being potentially harmed. That's a discussion about whether or not we pay for reproductive materials. And I'm just saying there's so many conversations we're not having, and it seems easier to kind of block them and put them aside when they have to do with the manipulation of women's bodies. And in a context where women sometimes are there front and center asking for something like good information just about the potential physical consequences. And they're not saying, I wouldn't choose to do it. They're saying, I need to know so that I feel good about my decision. So thank you for raising that question. I think I'm one of the few people in this space that says, before you start telling me about the harms and benefits to the children that might be born of this technology, let's talk about the women who are going to be research participants if we go down this pathway. And I think that's really critical. And I want to say it's not just the women who are going to provide the genetic material, it's the women who you expect to carry those babies. And I understand we're working on artificial wombs, but that's a long way away. And in the meantime, you're asking women to participate in research. And you might be asking them to have constrained behaviors. Like, what if the research protocol says, if the physicians determine that this embryo has a genetic disease, you must terminate that pregnancy? Is it fair to ask women to do that in advance? Those are conversations we need to have.
I completely agree. And also I could add that from the Latin American bioethics, the feminist bioethics that we are trying to promote in the area, we need to think about intersectionality, not just because it's not just women, no? There are different levels of vulnerability of women who are selling their eggs and being part or not being part of research settings, like being excluded. And there's another level, two different levels of approaches that are very important in these discussions. And I just said you are one of the few who have been talking extensively about it. And I'm really glad that you are expanding on this.
Yeah, and I want to give credit here to Donna Dickinson, who years and years ago wrote a very important article called "The Lady Vanishes." And I really encourage you to have a look at that article, because one of the things that you can see in there is what has come to pass in a way, which is, if you are really paying attention to intersectionality, people care about the, and I'm using this in scare quotes, but the genetics of the embryo, more or less, depending on whether they think it's going to be used for research or reproduction. And there you also see people saying, well, these are very valuable eggs. They're white, they're high IQ, they're athletic. That's a good egg. We're going to spend a lot of money on that. This other egg over here, not worth very much, for whatever description you want to put on that other egg. And a lot of that speaks to things, like overt discrimination, eugenics, things like that become really important. And Donna Dickinson and others at that time were already predicting whose eggs would be valuable for therapies and whose eggs would be used for research because they would be discarded. So they would be genetically useful in terms of learning things in the lab, but we wouldn't want to do anything else with them. And there's a lot of subtle things we need to think about there. So yes, thank you for bringing that up. I think it's critically important.
Well, thank you. We don't have, well, we have 3 minutes, but I think we have, well, put in the table a lot of perspective, a lot of ramifications of this kind of technologies. I mean, editing genome, that are important to understand not only the biological situation, but also the social perspective, and in the gender perspective, because women are usually just, I don't want to say a word, but they are just used sometimes in science just because they have the ability to have children, and that's not fair at all. So I want to thank you, Professor Bailey, Marichui. Also, thank you very much for being here, for sharing with us your perspective, your experience, your knowledge. They are great because these are the type of forums that we want to, well, make publicly. So these topics, these issues are there to be thought and to have critical thoughts about them, not just they are just wow, yeah, CRISPR, we have genome editing now. No, what do we want with this? Not just because we can do it, we have to do it, and what do we want with it? So thank you very much. Um, and I'm going to go in Spanish for our public. De nuevo, muchas gracias a todos por estar aquí en esta conferencia magistral el día de hoy. Esta es nuestra última conferencia magistral, pero esperamos tener otras el próximo año, también otros eventos que todavía tenemos en la comisión, así que pueden seguirnos en nuestras redes sociales, en YouTube, en Facebook, en Twitter, bueno, X, y pueden mantenerse al tanto. También tenemos el newsletter y agradecemos de nuevo a nuestros ponentes por estar aquí y por ayudarnos con estos temas que pues requieren mucha experiencia y conocimiento. Pues sería todo. Muchísimas gracias y esperamos verlos próximamente.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Françoise. And we're going to be inviting you to the UNAM as well. I hope that you